You think the universe is something massive, but static. It's just there, fixed, like a stage where everything takes place. Galaxies are in their spots. Space is the background. It sounds reasonable, but it's wrong. The universe isn't standing still. It is expanding. Right now, in every direction. There is no center, no starting point you can point to. There is only space stretching itself. And this isn't philosophy. This is something we measure. Light from distant galaxies doesn't reach you the way it used to. It's stretched out, redshift, a trail, a signature. Space is stretching. Galaxies don't need to fly anywhere. The distance still increases. No thrust needed, no engines required, just space changing. Think further, rewind time. Everything moves closer together, closer still, until the entire universe compresses into a state you can hardly imagine. And this is when things get uncomfortable, because when you truly see this, when you truly understand it, your intuition collapses. Reality doesn't work the way you think it does. Never has. You've just seen that the universe isn't static, and that's strange enough, but things go even further. You think that when you look up at the sky, you're seeing the universe as it exists right now. It sounds reasonable. But again, it's wrong. What you see is only the portion of light that has had enough time to reach your eyes. No more, no less. Light takes time to travel, and that creates a very specific limit to what you can know. When you look at a galaxy billions of light years away, you aren't seeing it in the present. You're looking into its past, billions of years ago, like an old photograph floating in space, and that leads to an uncomfortable consequence. There are parts of the universe that exist right now, but you will never see them, not because they are hidden, but because their light has never had the chance to reach you. This is what we call the observable universe, and it isn't the whole universe, but only the part from which you can access information. Don't imagine it as a wall, because there is no wall there, no physical boundary, only an invisible limit created by the speed of light and time. And as the universe continues to expand, something even stranger happens. There are regions of space moving away from you so fast that light from there will never, under any circumstances, reach you. Not that it hasn't arrived yet, but that it will never arrive. Permanently beyond the possibility of observation. Think about that for a moment. There are galaxies, structures, perhaps things entirely different existing out there, and you will never know they exist. Not because you lack technology, not because you aren't smart enough, but because the structure of the universe itself doesn't allow you to know. And this is when you begin to realize something deeper. The limits of human understanding don't just come from us, but from the very reality we are trying to understand. You've just accepted that there are parts of the universe you will never see, but that is only the surface of the matter, because the next step is what truly breaks your intuition. You need to distinguish clearly between two things that most people accidentally mix up: the observable universe, the part from which light can reach you, and the entire actual universe that exists, which could be much larger, perhaps even without limit. What you see in the night sky, all the galaxies that telescopes can record, is just a tiny bubble of information defined by the speed of light and the age of the universe. Outside that bubble, nothing stops. There is no wall, no edge, only regions of space that you cannot access. Not because you don't have enough technology, but because physics doesn't allow you to know how they exist. And now things start to get truly weird, because some modern cosmological models allow for a possibility that your intuition almost refuses to accept. The universe could be spatially infinite, not just very large, not just hard to imagine, but having no end point, no place where you can go and say, this is the edge of everything. If that is true, the consequence is no longer philosophical but pure mathematics. In an infinite space, with a finite but incredibly large number of configurations of matter, structures not only can repeat but must repeat, not once but an infinite number of times. If you have a finite number of ways to arrange particles, but an infinite space to put them in, then sooner or later, those arrangements will reappear somewhere. This leads to an idea that most people find uncomfortable to think about, somewhere far beyond any distance you can imagine. There may exist regions of space where matter is arranged in a way nearly identical to where you are standing. Not exactly the same, but similar enough to create familiar structures like stars, planets, even biological systems operating under similar laws. This isn't a science fiction story, but a consequence of probability applied to an extremely large or infinite scale. And even if the universe isn't perfectly infinite, but just extremely large, the practical conclusion doesn't change much. The part you know is insignificant compared to the part you don't. But here is the most important point. Because when you truly understand this scale, not through numbers, but through how you visualize it, something begins to happen. The feeling that you are in a special position in the universe begins to dissolve. There is no center, no absolute reference point. Every point in space looks the same on a large scale, which means you aren't in the middle of anything at all. You're just at a random location in a system whose scale far exceeds your brain's processing power. The human brain evolved to understand distances of a few meters, a few kilometers, not billions of light years, and certainly not infinity. So when you try to apply that intuition to the universe, you will be wrong. Not just a little bit wrong, but wrong at a fundamental level. And this is where everything begins to pivot. Because when you realize that the universe wasn't designed around you, that it has no center, no purpose directed toward humans, you begin to re-examine the questions you once thought were obvious. Concepts like meaning, a special role, or a central position begin to lose their foundation, not because they are meaningless, but because they are no longer guaranteed by the structure of reality. And when you reach that point, when you truly accept that you are just a tiny part of a massive system with no center, something almost inevitable happens. You start to ask questions, but they are no longer questions about distance or size. They are deeper, more uncomfortable questions. Humans have carried since long before we knew about the expanding universe or redshift. When humans face a reality too large to fully comprehend, they don't just measure and calculate. They begin to search for meaning. They want to know what all of this is for and where they fit into the whole picture. And almost immediately a question arises. A question you have certainly heard in many forms. If reality has an order, if the universe operates according to laws so precise we can describe them with mathematics, then why does evil exist? This isn't a small question or a fleeting curiosity. It is one of the oldest questions humans have ever asked, appearing in religion, in philosophy, and even seeping into how we think about science. And you can see why. Because it touches on a very direct contradiction. If there is a fundamental order, if there is a logical structure to the universe, then why are there things that seem to break that order, causing suffering, chaos, and results we call negative? But this is exactly where you need to stop for a moment. Because the way the question is framed already contains a very strong assumption that most people don't realize. When you ask why does evil exist or who created evil, you are unintentionally assuming that evil is something that exists independently, like matter or energy, something that can be created, added to the universe, or have an origin like a physical phenomenon. You are treating it as a real component of reality, on par with the things physics describes and measures. And if you accept that assumption, then you have locked yourself into a very specific way of looking at it, where the question is almost impossible to answer because you are looking for the origin of something you haven't even checked to see if it exists in the way you think it does. This isn't the first time humans have done this. In the history of science, we have many times named a phenomenon and then assumed the name corresponds to an independent entity. We used to think that heat was a substance, that cold was something that existed separately, that fire was an element. And each time, science had to go back and ask a very basic question. Are we describing reality, or are we imposing our understanding onto it? And in this case, the question of evil might be making that very same mistake. You have a word, a concept, an experience that is very real in life, and you turn it into something that seems to exist independently, and then you ask where it comes from. But if the assumption itself is wrong, then the entire question will lead you in the wrong direction. No matter how intelligently you try to answer it, this is the point where we need to re-examine the foundation, not through faith, not through intuition, but through the approach science always takes. Dismantle the problem and examine each of its parts. When you do that, when you pause and ask again, does evil truly exist as an independent thing? Or is it just a way we describe a certain kind of phenomenon? You begin to open up an entirely different direction. And this direction doesn't start by providing an immediate answer, but by recognizing that maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't that we haven't found the right answer, but that we've been asking the wrong question from the start. And when you accept that possibility, you have taken a massive step, because you are no longer trapped in the old way of understanding. You begin to be ready to look at the problem from a different perspective, one that might be simpler, but also much more profound. You need to do something science always demands, but your intuition often resists. Stop and doubt your own question. There is a very real and also very uncomfortable possibility that the question, who created evil, is not a profound question, but a fundamentally flawed one. Look closely at what you just did when you used the phrase evil. You are talking about it as if it were a thing, an entity, something that could exist independently, like a rock, a planet, or a particle of matter. You are unconsciously assigning it a state of existence, and then asking about its origin as if that were obvious. But this is the logical leap you haven't yet examined. Not everything we name corresponds to an entity in the physical world. There are words that are just ways we describe a phenomenon, a state, or a relationship between other elements, and if you don't distinguish that, you start to confuse the map with the territory. When you say evil, you might be describing a set of behaviors, consequences, or certain conditions, rather than a thing that exists independently in the universe in a physical sense. If that is true, then asking who created it is like asking who created darkness or who created silence. The question sounds reasonable, but it is actually built on an assumption that isn't right from the start. This isn't a small detail you can ignore, but a core principle of how science operates. Science doesn't start by answering the question. It starts by checking if the question is framed correctly. Throughout history, humans have repeatedly made the mistake of assigning entity status to things that are merely descriptions. At one point, we believed that cold was something that existed separately, as if there were a form of matter carrying coldness that could be added or taken away. But as we understood thermodynamics better, we realized there is no such thing as cold in that sense, only lower energy levels of heat. What you feel isn't cold attacking you, but a lack of thermal energy in the system. Similarly, we used to think fire was a basic element, an independent existence, until chemistry showed it was just a reaction process, a rearrangement of molecules under specific conditions. This happens repeatedly in the history of science. We name a phenomenon, then confuse that name with a real entity. And now you need to ask yourself if evil is falling into that same trap. If you haven't proven it exists as an independent entity, then asking about its origin is premature, even misguided. You are trying to solve a math problem where the prompt might have been wrong from the very first line. This doesn't mean evil doesn't exist in the sense of experience, because obviously you can see its consequences in the world, but it might not exist in the way you are assuming. This is where scientific thinking begins to differ entirely from common thinking. Instead of trying to find an answer that fits the current question, science is willing to go back, dismantle the question, and even discard it if necessary. This doesn't make the problem go away. It makes it clearer, because when you remove a false assumption, you don't lose information, you remove noise. And sometimes, simply cleaning up the question is enough for the answer to become obvious without needing any further hypotheses. So instead of asking who created evil, you might need to ask an entirely different question. One that doesn't preassume that evil is an independent entity. Perhaps you need to ask under what conditions it appears, what factors it depends on, and whether it is truly a thing, or just the way you describe a state when something else is no longer present. When you start to reframe the question that way, you don't just change how you find the answer. You change the entire structure of the problem. You are no longer trapped in a pre-shaped frame of thought, but begin to look at reality in a more flexible, more accurate way. This is the crucial turning point, because once you accept that the problem might lie in how you ask the question, you have escaped one of the greatest traps of thinking, believing your own questions are always right. And from that point, you begin to move closer to a true understanding of what you are trying to call evil. Not as a mysterious entity needing explanation, but as a phenomenon needing analysis in its proper context. Now do something simple, a thought experiment you can perform right in your own head. No equipment, no complex formulas. Just your willingness to set intuition aside for a moment and look closer at what you still think is obvious. Think about cold. You have experienced it thousands of times in winter, when stepping metal, when stepping into an air-conditioned room. You feel cold, and you are almost certain that cold is something that exists, something acting upon your body. It sounds reasonable, even obvious. But the problem is, it's wrong. Not just a little bit wrong, but wrong at a physical level. Wrong in how you understand what is actually happening. In physics, there is no entity called cold. There are no cold particles, no cold energy, no substance that you can add to a system to make it colder. All that exists is thermal energy, the motion of molecules. When molecules move fast, they carry more energy, and you call that state hot. When motion slows down, energy decreases, and you call that state cold. But stop here for a moment and think very carefully. You don't add cold to a system. You only take heat away. You don't create cold. You create a deficit of heat. What you feel is not a thing attacking you, but the absence of something else. This is where your intuition begins to be challenged. Because your experience is real, the sensation of cold is real. But your explanation of that experience is inaccurate. You don't feel cold in the sense of an independent entity being transmitted into you. You are feeling your body losing thermal energy to the surrounding environment. Heat leaves you, and your nervous system interprets that as a sensation of cold. No cold thing entered, no stream of cold energy flowed into your body. Only energy leaving, and this has a very important consequence. If you put heat back, if you provide energy to the system, what you call cold disappears instantly. You don't have to remove any cold thing, because no such thing ever existed. This is an incredibly simple example, but also an incredibly powerful one of how we can be deceived by our own language. We name an experience, and then we start treating that name as if it were a real entity. And once you've done that, you start asking the wrong questions. You might ask, where does cold come from? What creates cold? How do we stop cold? But all those questions are built on an incorrect assumption. They assume cold is something that can be created and moved, when in reality it is just the result of a lack of something else. This doesn't just happen with temperature. It is a recurring pattern in how humans understand the world. We have a tendency to turn descriptions into entities, states into objects, and then lock ourselves in unanswerable questions. This thought experiment is important, not because it teaches you about heat, but because it gives you a tool, a way of thinking. It shows you that there are things you thought existed independently, but are actually just results of a deficit. And if you don't realize that, you will keep searching for causes for things that don't need causes in the way you think. Now take it one step further. Hold this model in your head and apply it more broadly. When you encounter a concept you think you understand, ask yourself, is this a real entity, or just a way of describing a state when another quantity changes? When you do that, you begin to distinguish between reality and your interpretation of reality. And that is a huge step, because once you start looking at the world this way, you will see that many things you once thought existed are actually just gaps, absences, results of something else being missing. And when you recognize that pattern, you become ready to apply it to harder questions that previously seemed to have no solution. Because perhaps, just like cold, the problem isn't that you haven't found the answer, but that you are trying to find a cause for something that doesn't exist in the way you imagine. Now, hold that model in your mind and try another example. One so familiar that you almost never question it: darkness. You have been in the dark countless times. You walk into a room without a light. You flip the switch, and immediately you say that darkness appears. It sounds very natural, but stop for a moment and ask a very simple question. What is darkness really? In physics, there is no entity called darkness. There are no darkness particles flying around, and there is no darkness energy propagating through space the way light does. All that exists is light photons, quanta of energy moving and interacting with matter. When those photons are not present, when they do not reach your location, you call that state darkness. This means darkness is not something that is created. It is the result of a lack of light. You cannot turn on darkness the way you turn on an energy source. You can only turn off the light. You cannot shine a beam of darkness into a room. You can only prevent light from entering. What you call darkness is actually the absence of something else. This is not a metaphor. It is an accurate physical description. If you bring light back, darkness disappears instantly, without the need to push it out or remove any entity at all. It simply no longer exists, because the condition by which it was defined is gone. This might seem obvious when discussing light, but it contains a deeper principle about how we understand the world. You have a very real experience. You give it a name, and then you start treating that name as if it represents an independently existing thing. You say, the darkness is there. Darkness spreads. Darkness envelops. And that language makes you think darkness is something with its own behavior. But if you look closer, you will see that all that is happening is a change in the presence of light. Your language is convenient, but it is not accurate. And when language is inaccurate, your thinking begins to drift. You start asking questions that have no physical meaning, such as, where does darkness come from? Or how do we stop darkness from spreading? When the true answer always involves light, not an entity called darkness. This is the pattern you need to recognize. Not everything you experience corresponds to an independent entity in the world. There are things that are just ways for you to describe a state when another factor is no longer present. And if you do not distinguish that, you will continue to build questions based on false assumptions, just as you did with coal. Now you have two independent examples from two different fields, but they lead to the same conclusion. There are concepts you think exist, but are actually just the deficiency of something else. And when two examples start to align like that, you are no longer talking about a special case. You are seeing a principle. That principle says that sometimes what you call a thing is not actually a thing, but a void state, when a condition is not met. And this is where things start to get interesting. Because if this principle holds true for heat and light, if it repeats in many different physical systems, then there is no reason for you to exclude the possibility that it also applies to more complex concepts. Things you think exist independently might just be the result of the absence of another factor. And if that is true, then your entire understanding of certain concepts will have to change. You no longer ask, where does it come from? You ask, what is missing? You no longer look for a mysterious origin. You look for an unmet condition. And when you start thinking that way, you don't just change the answer. You change the question itself. This not only makes the problem clearer, but it also makes it simpler in a way you didn't expect. And now when you have these two pieces of the puzzle, cold and darkness, both being the absence of something else, you begin to have enough tools to return to the original question. Not to answer it immediately, but to look at it under a completely different light. A light you have never used before, because perhaps, just as in the last two examples, what you are looking for is not the origin of an existing thing, but the reason why something else is not present. With two clear examples in mind, cold and darkness, neither being an independent entity, but only the absence of something else, you begin to have a new tool to look back at the original question in a completely different way. Instead of continuing to assume that evil is an independent thing, some force created and introduced into the universe, you can stop and ask a simpler but more accurate question. What if evil also operates under the same principle? What if it is not a thing that needs to be created, but only a state that appears when a certain condition is no longer met? This is a crucial shift, because as soon as you allow for that possibility, your entire approach to the problem begins to change. You are no longer searching for a mysterious origin. You no longer ask who created it. Instead, you start to ask, what is missing? And that question is completely different. It is more specific. It is testable. And most importantly, it is not based on an unproven assumption. When you look at the behavior you call evil, you begin to realize that it often appears under very specific conditions, situations, where a certain factor is not present. Perhaps empathy is not present. Perhaps awareness is not present. Perhaps responsibility is not present. You do not need to assume there is some invisible force driving the behavior. You only need to observe that when certain conditions vanish, certain behaviors appear. This is not abstract philosophy, but how science often approaches a problem. You do not assume a new entity if you can explain a phenomenon through the change of known factors. This is the principle of parsimony in science. Do not add assumptions if they are not necessary. If you can explain what you call evil through the absence of factors like awareness, control, or empathy, then you do not need to assume it is an independent force. This not only simplifies the problem, but also makes it testable. You can observe when those factors disappear. You can measure the conditions under which behavior changes. You can predict when a system will produce a negative result without invoking an abstract entity. And this is the point where this approach becomes more powerful than any explanation based on mere belief, because it gives you the ability to analyze, predict, and even intervene. If evil is an independent force, you can do nothing about it other than accept or fear it. But if it is the result of the absence of something, then you can change those conditions. You can reintroduce the necessary factor. You can reduce or entirely eliminate the state you call evil. This moves the problem from a metaphysical question to a practical one, a problem you can work with. And more importantly, it aligns with how we have seen the world function in the previous examples. You don't create light by fighting darkness. You bring light in. You don't eliminate cold by pushing the cold out. You provide heat. The same principle repeats across different systems. And if that principle holds true when applied to human behavior, then you are moving very close to an understanding of the problem that is not only simpler, but also more accurate. This doesn't mean the original question becomes meaningless, but rather that it needs to be reframed. You no longer ask, why does evil exist? You ask, when and why are the things necessary to prevent it no longer present? And that is a question science can approach because it relates to conditions, to systems, and to specific causes. This is where everything starts to click together, not with a single answer, but with a consistent pattern where phenomena you once thought were mysterious begin to become more understandable when you see them as consequences of absence rather than independent existence. If you think this is just wordplay or a reinterpretation of a concept, then we now need to move from theory to reality, from physics to human behavior. Because if this principle is truly correct, it must appear in the world that you can observe, measure, and test. This is where the work of Philip Zimbardo becomes extremely important, not because it tells a shocking story, but because it gives you a concrete example of how behavior you call evil can appear without assuming it is a fixed essence within a human being. The Stanford prison experiment began very simply. The participants chosen were ordinary students with no history of violence and no signs of psychological abnormalities, and they were randomly divided into two groups, one group playing prisoners, the other playing guards. No one was trained to be cruel. No one was asked to act maliciously. But what happened next is something that makes you stop and think. In a very short amount of time, the behavior of these individuals began to change. Those playing the role of guards began to become more controlling, harsher, and in many cases, crueler. Those playing the role of prisoners became passive, anxious, and submissive. This was not because they became someone else, but because the environment had changed the conditions surrounding their behavior. Notice the important thing here: no evil was added to the system. No invisible force appeared to turn these people cruel. All that changed was the context, the structure, and the factors controlling behavior that you normally do not recognize. When personal responsibility is diminished, when power is granted without control, when supervision and feedback disappear, things you call negative begin to emerge. This fits perfectly with the principle you just saw in physics. You do not need to create a new thing. You only need to remove certain conditions, and another state appears. In this case, what was removed might have been empathy, might have been a sense of responsibility, might have been an awareness of consequences. When those factors are no longer present, behavior changes. And here is the key point. This shows that what you call evil is not necessarily a fixed essence residing inside a human being waiting to be activated. It can be the result of a system, a set of conditions where certain necessary factors are absent. This not only changes how you look at this experiment, but also how you look at human behavior in general. Instead of asking, why is that person evil, You can ask what changed in the environment that made that behavior possible. This is a question that can be tested, analyzed, and most importantly, it does not require you to assume the existence of an abstract entity. Zimbardo's experiment was not perfect, and it has been debated extensively in science. But its value lies not in the technical details, but in the model it suggests. Human behavior is not separate from context. When you change the context, you change the behavior. When you remove controlling factors, you create the conditions for negative behaviors to emerge. And this brings you back to the original principle in a very clear way. Just as you don't create cold but only take away heat, and you don't create darkness but only remove light, you may not create evil, but only create a system where the factors that prevent it no longer exist. And if that is true, then the question of evil is no longer a question of a mysterious origin, but a question of conditions, of structure, of what is present and what is absent in a specific system. And that is a kind of question you can start to answer by observing the real world, rather than by imagining forces you cannot verify. The important thing lies not in how shocking that experiment was, but in the mechanism behind it. Because if you don't understand the mechanism, you will revert back to the old assumption that there is something inside a person that suddenly appears. But when you look closer, you begin to see that behavior changes, not because human nature changes, but because the conditions surrounding the behavior have been adjusted. When personal responsibility is diminished, when a person no longer feels they must bear direct consequences for their actions, the brain begins to process decisions differently. This is not philosophy, it is experimental psychology. When you place a person in a system where they are just a small part of a larger structure, where decisions are dispersed and where orders come from the outside, the sense of responsibility is diluted. And when responsibility is diluted, behavior changes. You don't need to assume the person became bad. You only need to observe that the conditions for maintaining controlled behavior are no longer there. Next is the element of power. When an individual is given power without clear control mechanisms, their brain begins to adjust behavior to the new role. It is not because they want to become someone else, but because the signaling system they receive has changed. They are encouraged to act in a certain way. And if there is no strong enough negative feedback, that behavior is reinforced. This is how learning works in the brain, through reinforcement and feedback. Power, in this case, is not a magical force transforming humans, but a condition that changes how the brain evaluates actions. Then there is the social structure. When you place a person in a specific role with clear expectations of how they should behave, they begin to adjust their behavior to fit that role. This is a phenomenon that has been studied extensively. Humans do not just act based on themselves, but based on the role they believe they are assuming. When that role allows or even encourages negative behavior, those behaviors become more likely to occur. And the important thing is that all of this happens without changing the nature of that person. Your brain does not operate in a vacuum. It continuously receives signals from the environment, from those around you, and from the social structure you are in. And it adjusts behavior based on those signals. This means that behavior is not entirely internal. It is not a fixed, pre-programmed thing. It is the result of the interaction between the individual and the environment. When you change the environment, you change the behavior. When you remove certain factors like personal responsibility, supervision, or feedback, you create conditions for behaviors you call negative to emerge. This does not require an independent force called evil. It only requires a specific set of conditions. And this is the point where the principle you saw earlier begins to repeat once again. You don't need to create a new thing to explain the phenomenon. You only need to look at what is missing. When light is not present, you have darkness. When heat is not present, you have cold. When factors such as awareness, responsibility, and control are not present, you have behaviors you call negative. This does not make the problem simpler in a pleasant sense, but it makes it clearer. It gives you a way to analyze, rather than just describe, and more importantly, it gives you a way to intervene. If behavior depends on conditions, and changing the conditions can change the behavior, this shifts the question from why are humans evil to what conditions cause this behavior to emerge. And that is a question you can begin to answer by observing the real world, rather than relying on untestable assumptions. The point you just saw in psychology becomes even clearer when you look toward philosophy, particularly Hannah Arendt's analysis of what she called the banality of evil. The crucial thing here is that she didn't describe evil as something dark, demonic, or residing outside of humanity. On the contrary, she pointed out that it can emerge in very ordinary circumstances from completely ordinary people. When she observed individuals responsible for cruel acts in history, she didn't see monsters in the sense your intuition expects. She saw people who seemed normal, with no signs of obvious deviance, not acting out of a motive of intense hatred, but simply following orders, complying with procedures, and continuing to perform their roles without stopping to think deeply about the consequences. This leads to an uncomfortable but very important conclusion. Evil does not require an explicit bad intention to exist. It can emerge from the absence of thought, when a person stops questioning their actions, when they no longer self-examine what they are doing. They begin to operate as part of a larger system where decisions are no longer guided by individual awareness, but by external structures. And this is the point you need to notice, because it fits surprisingly well with the principle you saw earlier. You don't need an independent entity called evil to explain these behaviors. You only need one condition: the absence of critical thinking. When the ability to think, question, and evaluate is removed or suspended, a void appears in the human decision-making system. And in that void, behavior can continue to occur without being controlled by the criteria you usually use to judge it. This is not an excuse for behavior, but a description of the mechanism. It shows you that the behavior you call evil may not need a complex cause or a special force, but only a missing condition. This also explains why ordinary people under different conditions can act in very different ways. It's not because their nature mysteriously changes, but because the factors controlling their behavior change. When a system encourages compliance rather than thought, when it minimizes personal responsibility and replaces it with commands, it creates an environment where behavior can detach from personal awareness. And when that happens, you don't need to ask, why are they evil? You need to ask what has been removed from their decision-making process. This is a very important shift in how you view the problem. It takes you away from labeling people and moves you into system analysis. It also makes the problem more concrete because you can identify the conditions under which behavior changes. When critical thinking is absent, when individuals are no longer self-accountable for their actions, and when external structures take control, negative behaviors can emerge without needing any abstract entity for explanation. This once again repeats the pattern you've seen. It's not that a thing is added, but that something is missing. And when you look at the problem that way, you begin to see a consistency across physics, psychology, and philosophy. The phenomena are different, but the principle is the same. Not the presence of a mysterious entity, but the absence of a necessary condition. And when you realize that, you begin to move closer to an understanding of what you call evil, without needing to assume it exists as an independent force in the universe. The point you just saw in Hannah Arendt's analysis becomes much clearer when you don't view thoughtlessness as a vague description, but as a specific mechanism in how the brain operates. Think of it as an information processing system. When everything is functioning normally, your brain is constantly evaluating actions, predicting consequences, comparing choices, and adjusting behavior based on long-term goals. But this costs energy, takes time, and requires attention. Therefore, in many situations, the brain will switch to a different mode faster and less costly, the automatic response mode. This is how you drive a car on a familiar road without thinking about every move, or how you perform a repetitive habit without analyzing every step. In most cases, this mechanism is very useful. It helps you save cognitive resources. But the problem arises when this mechanism is triggered in situations that ought to require thought. When the brain doesn't analyze an action, it doesn't stop to ask, where will this lead? It simply reacts according to the immediate signal, the command, the habit, or the environmental pressure. This sharply reduces the ability to evaluate long-term consequences. You no longer see the chain of outcomes of a behavior. You only see the next step to be taken. And this is where the cognitive gap appears. It's not that you completely lose the ability to think, but that you aren't using it at the critical moment. A part of the system is turned off or bypassed, and the rest continues to operate as if everything is fine. In that gap, behavior is not controlled by the criteria you normally use to evaluate it. There is no checking step, no why question, no pausing to consider consequences. The action continues, but without cognitive oversight. This creates a very specific condition, your behavior without the full presence of awareness. And when that happens, you don't need to assume that some bad intention emerged from somewhere. You only need a very simple condition, the lack of presence of the thought process. This is the point where the principle you saw earlier repeats very clearly. Just as you don't need to create cold, but only take away heat. You don't need to create darkness, but only remove light. You don't need to create evil. If you can create a system where the thought process is no longer properly present, when the evaluation mechanism is interrupted, when the analytical process is not triggered, behavior can continue in directions that you, in a state of full thought, would not choose. This is not an abstract hypothesis. It fits with what we know about how the brain works. The fast processing system, based on reflexes and habits, is always ready to take over when the slow system, based on analysis, is not activated. And in a suitable environment, where pressure is high, time is short, responsibility is diffuse, and external signals are strong, that fast system dominates. At that point, behavior is no longer guided by conscious thought, but by automatic mechanisms. This is why you can see completely ordinary people act in ways they would not accept in a different context. It's not because they suddenly became bad, but because the control mechanism failed to function as usual. When you understand this, you begin to see that thoughtlessness is not a moral critique, but a technical description of a state of the cognitive system. It is a condition that can appear, can be triggered, and can be studied. And when you look at it that way, you no longer need an abstract entity to explain negative behavior. You have a mechanism. You have a condition. You have a way to analyze when and why it happens. This doesn't make the problem simple in a pleasant sense, but it makes it clearer. It shifts the question from why are humans evil to when and why is the thought mechanism not triggered. And that is a question you can begin to answer by observing, measuring, and understanding the system rather than relying on assumptions you've never tested. You think everything is just an automatic reaction of the brain and environment, as if humans were merely a system controlled by external conditions. But that isn't the whole story. And this is where Viktor Frankl's observation becomes extremely important, because he looked at the most extreme circumstances humans have ever endured and discovered something that doesn't fit that simple explanation. In the concentration camps, where almost every factor of normal behavioral control was shattered, where humans were stripped of freedom, property, identity, and even hope, you might expect that behavior would be entirely determined by the environment, that everyone would react the same way to the same harsh pressure. But what Frankl observed was different. He noticed that even in those conditions, there were still clear differences in how people reacted. There were those who became hopeless, those who acted cruelly toward others to survive. But there were also those who still maintained a level of human dignity, who still shared their meager portion of food, and who still chose a way of behaving that was not entirely dictated by conditions. This doesn't mean the environment isn't important, but that it doesn't entirely decide everything. Even when most factors are controlled, there still exists a small space, very small, but not zero, where an individual can choose their response. This is not an abstract concept, but a factual observation in the harshest of conditions. That space is not large. It doesn't allow you to change the circumstances, but it allows you to choose how you face those circumstances, and it is right there that responsibility emerges. Not responsibility in the sense of moral imposition from the outside, but responsibility arising from the ability to choose. If there is no choice, there is no responsibility. But if there exists even a tiny level of choice, then your behavior is no longer entirely determined, and you cannot completely detach yourself from the outcome of that behavior. This is the point where the picture becomes more complete. On one side, you see that behavior can be strongly influenced by the environment, by structures, and by the absence of control factors like awareness and responsibility. On the other side, you see that even when those factors are reduced to a minimum, a possibility of choice still exists. This means human behavior cannot be explained entirely by a single factor. It is not purely internal, but it is not purely determined from the outside either. It is the result of the interaction between condition and choice. And this is the important point. If what you call evil can appear when certain conditions are absent, then whether it actually appears or not in a specific situation still relates to whether the individual uses that space of choice. This doesn't make the problem simpler, but it makes it more accurate. It shows that you cannot just blame the environment, just as you cannot just blame nature. You must consider both. And more importantly, it shows that human behavior has meaning precisely because there is choice. If everything were entirely determined, there would be nothing to evaluate. But if a space exists, however small, where you can choose, then what you do in that space becomes important. And this is the point where the principle you've built begins to connect with the original question in a new way. If evil is not an independent force, but the result of the absence of certain conditions, then whether those conditions are maintained or not depends, to some degree, on how humans use their capacity for choice. This leads you to a very different conclusion than where you started. You no longer ask who created evil, but you start to ask under what conditions does it emerge, and what is the role of individual choice within that. What you just saw from Viktor Frankl's observation is not a rare exception, but a sign of a deeper mechanism in how the brain operates. And this is when you need to look at the concept of freedom of choice through a scientific lens rather than as a vague or purely philosophical idea. The human brain is not a simple linear response system where a stimulus always leads to a single reaction. It is a complex network capable of processing multiple signals at once, comparing options, predicting consequences, and most importantly, delaying a response long enough to create a difference. When a situation occurs, you don't just receive a single signal. You receive a mass of information from the environment, from memory, from emotion, and from previously learned behavior models. The brain can react immediately according to the automatic mode you saw earlier, but it also has the capacity to trigger another process slower, more analytical, where you stop and evaluate. It is precisely this ability to switch between these two modes that creates what you call freedom of choice. It is not absolute freedom. It's not the ability to do anything regardless of all conditions. It is the ability to not be locked into a single response. This means that in the same circumstances, with the same stimulus, you can still produce different reactions, depending on whether you activate the thought process or not. When you stop, even for a very brief moment, and question your action, you are changing the entire trajectory of the behavior. You are introducing an extra layer of processing into the system, and that layer can change the outcome. This is not an assumption, but something that has been observed in research on cognition and neuroscience. Brain regions involved in executive control and decision-making can adjust or even inhibit automatic responses if they are properly activated. This creates a direct link between awareness and action, not in an abstract sense, but in a mechanical sense. When a cognitive process is activated, it changes how signals are processed and therefore changes the behavior. And this is exactly where personal responsibility emerges as a factual factor, not as a moral concept imposed from the outside, but as a consequence of the system's structure. If you have the ability, even to a certain degree, to change your response by activating the thought process, then your behavior is no longer entirely determined by circumstances. This doesn't deny the role of the environment. It only adds that the environment is not the sole factor. You have a part of control, and that part lies in your ability to use your cognitive system. When you don't use it, when you let the automatic mechanism dominate, you return to the model you saw earlier, where behavior is guided by conditions and lacks checking. But when you use it, you create a difference, a point of departure from the flow of automatic reaction. And that is where behavior begins to be personal. This is a very important point because it connects everything you have seen up until now. You have external conditions that can reduce or remove the factors of behavioral control. You have psychological mechanisms that can switch you into an automatic response state. But you also have a capacity located within the very structure of the brain that allows you to intervene in that process. This doesn't guarantee that you will always choose better, but it guarantees that you are not completely locked into a single choice. And the very existence of this capacity makes the entire question of behavior meaningful. Without it, everything is just reaction. But because it exists, however small, your behavior becomes part of a system that you can, to some degree, influence. And that is the point where the principle of absence begins to combine with the concept of choice. Because if what you call evil emerges when certain factors like awareness are not present, then whether those factors are present or not depends in part on whether you activate your ability to think. And that is no longer a metaphysical question, but a question of how you operate your own cognitive system in each specific situation. If you take a step back and look at this entire journey as a system rather than as disconnected pieces, something begins to emerge very clearly. Fields that seem different are converging on the same principle. In physics, you saw that what we call cold or darkness are not independent entities, but the result of the absence of heat and light. They do not need to be created. They appear when a condition is no longer met. In psychology, you saw that human behavior is not a fixed expression of an immutable nature, but depends heavily on conditions, context, and whether factors like responsibility, supervision, and feedback are present. When those factors are reduced or removed, behavior changes in ways that you might previously have called negative. In philosophy, particularly through Hannah Arendt's analysis, you saw that awareness, or more precisely the presence of the thought process, plays a decisive role in controlling action. When that process is absent, humans can act without internal checks. And when you place these pieces side by side, a pattern begins to reveal itself. It is not the appearance of a new entity that explains the phenomena, but the disappearance of a necessary condition. This is not a random coincidence between fields, but a sign of a deeper structure in how reality functions. Science, at different levels, is saying the same thing in different languages. Physics speaks of energy and its distribution. Psychology speaks of behavior and its conditions. And philosophy speaks of awareness and its role. But they all point in one direction. What you observe is not always the result of having something extra, but very often the result of missing something. This is extremely important because it changes the way you ask questions. When you look at a phenomenon and automatically assume there must be a positive cause, some force added to create it, you might be overlooking a simpler possibility. A condition has vanished. This principle not only makes your model tidier, but also makes it more testable. You can ask, what factor is absent? And if I bring it back, what will happen? This is how science progresses. Not by adding unnecessary entities, but by finding the minimal structure that can explain the phenomenon. When you piece the fields together, you start to see a consistent picture where different phenomena are no longer isolated but linked through the same principle. The sensation of cold, the appearance of darkness, the change of behavior within a system, the banality of actions you once thought were extraordinary, all can be understood as different cases of the same model, a state that emerges when a necessary factor is not present. This does not reduce the complexity of the world, but increases the precision of how you describe it. It allows you to replace vague concepts with specific conditions and untestable questions with checkable hypotheses. And more importantly, it creates a bridge between fields. You no longer have to choose between physics, psychology, or philosophy as competing explanations, because they do not compete, they complement each other. Each field provides a perspective, a layer of description of the same reality. And when those layers fit together, you have a model far stronger than any single layer alone. This is the point where you can return to the original question with a completely different set of tools. You are no longer bound by the old way of framing the question, where you assumed the existence of an independent entity, but can check whether the phenomenon you are trying to understand can be explained as a consequence of absence. And when you do that, you don't just change the answer. You change the way you perceive the entire issue. The picture is no longer fragmented, no longer a conflict between fields, but becomes consistent in a way you didn't see before, because you didn't have the principle to connect them. Now is the time to return to the original question, but not with the same outlook as before. Rather, with everything you have just seen, because if you keep the question as it is, without re-examining its assumptions, you will repeat the same mistake. The question, who created evil, sounds profound, but it contains a very specific assumption that evil is an independent entity, something that exists in a way similar to matter or energy, something that can be created, can have an origin, and therefore can be traced back to an initial cause. But everything you have just gone through, from physics to psychology and philosophy, points to the opposite phenomena. You thought were things might actually just be states that appear when another condition is no longer present. Cold is not an entity. Darkness is not an entity. And negative behavior does not necessarily come from a fixed nature or an independent force. When you apply that same principle, the assumption that evil is an entity begins to become unnecessary, even misleading. And here is the important point. If the initial assumption is wrong, then the entire question built upon it will lead you to wrong conclusions, no matter how intelligently you try to answer it. This is not a minor issue of language, but an issue of the structure of thought. In science, asking the right question is often more important than finding a quick answer. A wrong question can generate a series of plausible but irrelevant answers. Conversely, a correctly framed question can make the answer become almost obvious. Therefore, instead of trying to find who or what created evil, you need to go back and check whether you are assuming the existence of something you haven't yet proven. When you remove that assumption, the question begins to change. It is no longer a question about the origin of an entity, but becomes a question about the conditions of a state. You no longer ask who created it, but ask, when does it appear and why? This shift might seem small in terms of wording, but it completely changes your approach to the problem. It moves you from a metaphysical framework where you seek untestable causes to a scientific framework where you seek specific conditions that can be observed and analyzed. And when you do that, you begin to see that many questions you once thought were unanswerable are actually only unanswerable within the old framework of questions. When you change the frame, the problem becomes clearer. This doesn't mean you have all the answers, but that you have removed a major barrier, an untested assumption. And when that barrier disappears, you can continue moving forward with a more accurate approach. This is how science operates. It doesn't just collect data and draw conclusions. It continuously goes back to check the very question it is trying to answer. In many cases, progress comes not from finding a new answer, but from realizing that the old question was framed incorrectly. And in this case, everything you have just seen points in the same direction. The question of evil needs to be reframed, not because it isn't important, but because the way you originally asked it doesn't align with how reality functions. When you accept that, you don't lose the question. You make it more precise. And that is the necessary step before you can proceed to a meaningful answer. From that point, you can look at how Albert Einstein approached this problem and realize why it is so simple that it causes many people to overlook it, but at the same time so profound that it changes the entire understanding. He did not begin by accepting that evil is an independently existing thing, nor did he try to find a mysterious origin for it in the way you find the origin of matter or energy. Instead, he went in an entirely different direction. He reframed the nature of the concept. If you have accepted that cold is not an entity but only a lack of heat, and that darkness is not something created but only the absence of light, then you have a very clear pattern. And Einstein simply applied that pattern to a field you previously thought was completely different. He did not say that evil was created. He said it appears when what you call good is no longer present. This is not a metaphor, but a logical analogy. You do not need a separate entity to explain a state if that state can be described as the deficiency of another condition. When you look at it that way, the question, who created evil, loses its foundation because you are no longer talking about a thing that needs to be created. You are talking about a state that emerges when a condition is not met. And this is what makes this approach powerful. It is not based on belief. It does not require you to accept a certain system of thought. It only requires you to apply the same principle you have already accepted in other fields. If you have agreed that there are phenomena that are not entities, but only absences, then applying that principle here is not a giant leap, but a logical next step. Its simplicity is its strength. It removes the need to assume an additional entity, a force, or an untestable origin. It brings the problem down to a level where you can analyze it. What is missing, and why is it missing? When you think this way, you are no longer stuck searching for a metaphysical cause, but you can look at specific conditions. This doesn't make the problem easier in an emotional sense, but it makes it clearer in a logical sense. You no longer ask, who created evil? You ask, when and why is good not present? And that is a question you can approach with the same methods you used in physics and psychology. This is why this answer can surprise many people. Not because it is complex, but because it is too simple. It adds nothing new to the system. It only removes an unnecessary assumption. And when you remove that assumption, the structure of the problem changes completely. You no longer see an unresolvable contradiction between an ordered universe and the existence of evil. Instead, you see a system where different states emerge depending on which conditions are present and which are not. And once you see that, you begin to realize that the answer lies not in searching for an entity, but in understanding the structure. Instead of asking, why is there evil? You try asking a different question. When is good not present? It might sound like just a small adjustment in wording, but in fact, it changes the entire structure of the problem. When you keep the old question, you force yourself to find a positive cause and entity, some force that creates evil, and you get stuck tracing the origin of something you haven't yet proven to exist independently. You are pushed into a framework of thought where every answer must assume that evil is real in a physical sense, and from there, every subsequent argument is bound by that assumption. But when you reverse the question, you are no longer looking for an entity. You begin looking for conditions, and that is a structural change, not just a linguistic one. This is a very familiar technique in science, often called inversion or problem reversal, where you don't continue digging into the original question, but flip it over to see what has been assumed without being checked. In many cases, it is this inversion that makes the problem clearer, because you remove layers of hidden assumptions that you didn't recognize before. When you ask, when is good not present? You shift focus from searching for a mysterious cause to identifying specific observable conditions. You start looking at situations where empathy is not present, where awareness is not triggered, where responsibility is diffused, and where social structures encourage compliance over thinking. These are factors you can see in the real world, can analyze and can test. You are no longer stuck in an abstract concept, but move to working with specific variables in a system. And as you do that, a pattern begins to emerge. You realize that what you call evil does not appear randomly. It is not a mysterious force creeping into the system, but is a conditional state that appears when certain factors are no longer present. This completely changes the way you approach the problem, because you are no longer trying to explain an entity. You are analyzing a structure. This is the power of problem inversion. It doesn't give you an immediate answer, but it leads you to the right kind of question, the kind you can continue to work with systematically. When you remove the assumption that evil is an independent entity, you don't make the problem empty. On the contrary, you make it analytically richer. You can consider many factors at once, compare different situations, and identify recurring conditions. And this fits perfectly with how science works. Not searching for unnecessary entities, but searching for sufficient conditions to explain a phenomenon. When you think this way, you start to see that the original question was not only difficult, but locked in the wrong frame. It forced you to find an answer that reality does not provide. But when you change the question, you open a new space where you can observe, experiment, and understand. This is not an evasion of the question, but a refinement of it, making it more compatible with how reality operates. And as you continue in this direction, you realize that many complex problems do not need a complex solution, but a more precise question. This small change in how the problem is framed is like rotating an object to see it from another angle. The object itself doesn't change, but its structure becomes clearer. When the light is shone correctly, you no longer need to guess. You can see. And that is exactly what inversion does to your thinking. It adds no new information, but removes false assumptions. And when those assumptions disappear, the true structure of the problem begins to reveal itself far more directly, clearly, and consistently than the original perspective. Once you have reversed the problem and seen that what you call evil may simply be the absence of a necessary condition, an inevitable consequence emerges. The focus of the question no longer lies on an external entity, but shifts directly toward human beings and their behavior. If evil is not an independent force that is created, but a state that appears when factors such as awareness, empathy, or responsibility are absent, then the question of who is responsible changes as well. It is no longer a metaphysical question about origins, but becomes a very specific question about what is done and what is not done in a given situation. You begin to realize that action is not the only factor that creates a result, but that inaction plays an equivalent role. When you do not intervene, when you do not ask questions, when you do not activate the thought process that you know you possess, you are not standing outside the system. You are still a part of it. And your doing nothing is not a neutral state, as you often think. It is a choice, and like every other choice, it has consequences. This is the point where many people feel uncomfortable, because your intuition wants to believe that if you do not directly cause a negative action, you are not involved in its outcome. But when you look at it the way we are built from the beginning, you see that the absence of a condition can be just as important as the presence of an action. If light is not present, darkness appears. If heat is not present, cold appears. And if factors like awareness, responsibility, or empathy are not present in a system, then the behaviors you call negative can emerge. That means you're not bringing those factors into the system, not maintaining them, and not activating them as a part of the cause. This is not a moralistic way of blaming, but a description of how the system works. You do not need to do something bad to create a negative result. You only need to not do what is necessary to prevent it from happening. This makes personal responsibility clearer, but also more complex. It no longer lies in whether you directly caused an action or not, but in whether you maintain the necessary conditions to control behavior. When you ask a question, when you stop to think, when you refuse to comply automatically, you are bringing those factors back into the system. When you do not do that, you allow a void to exist, and in that void, results will emerge in a way you may not desire. This shifts the entire issue from an abstract philosophical question to a very specific behavioral one. It is no longer how does the universe operate or who created this, but in this situation, what factors are present and what factors are absent, and what is your role in that? And that is a question you cannot answer by speculating about external forces. You must answer it by looking at your own actions, at how you react, and at whether you use the cognitive capacity you have. This is the point where the entire argument comes back to you, not as an imposed conclusion, but as a logical consequence of everything you have seen. If evil is not an independent entity, then it cannot be created by a single source outside of you. It must relate to how the system operates, and you are a part of that system. This does not mean you control everything, but it means you are not completely standing outside. You have a role, however small, in which conditions are maintained and which conditions are lacking. And when you take that seriously, the question is no longer, why does evil exist? But in specific moments, are you contributing to maintaining the conditions that prevent it? From that point, you can leave the grand concepts behind and look straight at daily life, where everything happens not in the form of philosophical questions, but in the form of very small, very ordinary, almost unnoticeable choices that accumulate over time into results much larger than you imagine. You do not need an extreme circumstance to see this principle at work because it is present in the simplest situations. When you do not pay attention to a small problem, when you delay dealing with a detail you know is important, you are not just doing nothing. You are allowing the system to continue operating without the necessary adjustment. And when that repeats, day after day, you begin to see a trend forming. Small decisions, nearly invisible when viewed in isolation, begin to accumulate into a clear trajectory. This is how complex systems work, not through sudden changes, but through small deviations repeated long enough. When you ignore a signal, when you do not ask a question, when you do not stop to think, you are creating a void in the process of behavioral control. And that void is not neutral. It is not just there without affecting anything. It allows other factors to fill in factors that you do not control. Behavior is not just what you do, but also what you do not do in critical moments. When you are not cognitively present, When you allow automatic mechanisms to take over without a check, you are letting the system operate according to rules you may not recognize. And if those rules lead to unwanted results, then your lack of intervention is not irrelevant, but a part of the cause. This can be seen in many different fields. In relationships, when you do not pay attention to small changes in communication, when you do not respond, do not adjust, small distances begin to widen. In work, when you overlook minor errors, when you do not recheck details, deviations accumulate and eventually lead to larger problems. In society, when behaviors are not controlled or questioned, they can become norms over time. All of these things do not need a special force to explain. They only need one condition: the lack of presence of awareness at critical points. When you do not pay attention, you don't just miss information, you change the trajectory of the system. And this brings you back to the principle you saw from the beginning, but at a very specific level. You do not need to create a negative result to see it appear. You only need to not maintain the necessary conditions to prevent it. This is why the small things matter, not because each individual action has great power, but because they accumulate. Each time you choose not to think, each time you let an automatic reaction decide for you, you are adding a step to a chain. And that chain, over time, becomes a trend. When you look back, the result may seem sudden, but it is actually the consequence of many small previous steps. This is not intended to create a sense of guilt, but to clarify the mechanism. If you understand that the system works this way, you can begin to intervene at small points. You don't need to change the entire system all at once. You only need to bring awareness back into the moments you previously overlooked. You stop, you ask questions, you check your actions. Each time you do so, you are reducing the void in the system. And when the void decreases, unwanted results decrease accordingly. This is how an abstract principle becomes a practical tool. It does not require you to understand the entire universe or solve big questions immediately. It requires you to look at what you are doing and what you are not doing in specific situations. And when you do that, you begin to see that your behavior is not a series of disconnected events, but part of a continuous system where each choice, however small, can contribute to shaping the final result. Now you can return to the entire journey we have just traversed and see it as a complete picture instead of fragmented pieces. Because from the expansion of the universe to the boundaries of what you can observe, from scales beyond intuition to experiments on human behavior, everything is pointing toward the same thing. Reality does not operate the way your initial intuition thinks. The universe was not designed to fit the human sense of right and wrong. It does not operate according to morality, but according to cold yet consistent natural laws that do not care what you think, do not care what you feel, but only reflect the structure of reality itself. And when you bring that same approach to the question of evil, you begin to see that the problem lies not in finding a force created to break the order, but in understanding how different states emerge when conditions change. You saw that in physics, where cold is not a thing but only a lack of heat, where darkness is not an entity but only the absence of light. You saw it in psychology, where behavior changes when the environment changes, when responsibility is diffused, when awareness is not activated. You saw it in philosophy, where Hannah Arendt pointed out that what we call evil can emerge not from a special intention, but from the banality of not thinking. And you also saw it in Viktor Frankl's observation, where even in the most extreme conditions, there still exists a tiny space for choice, a point where a human can intervene in their own system. When you piece all of this together, you no longer need an assumption that evil is an independent force or a created entity. You have a simpler but more powerful model. It is the consequence of the absence of something necessary. When awareness is not present, when responsibility is not maintained, when empathy is removed, a void appears. And in that void, the results you call negative can grow. This does not make the world simpler in a pleasant sense. It does not erase the complexity of human behavior or social systems, but it makes the structure of the problem clearer. You no longer have to search for mysterious causes beyond the possibility of verification. You can look at specific conditions, at the factors present and the factors absent. And when you do that, the original question changes once again. It is no longer a question about the universe or about a supreme entity, no longer who created evil, but becomes a more direct question, closer and also harder to avoid. In the specific moments of life, are you present? Are you using your ability to think? Or are you letting the automatic system operate without a check? Are you maintaining the necessary conditions to control behavior? Or are you letting them vanish? Because if everything you have seen is true, then what you call evil does not come from some distant place. It appears right at the points where your presence is missing. And that is not a moralistic conclusion, but a logical consequence of how the system operates. You do not control the entire universe. You do not control every condition, but you are not completely standing outside. You are a part of the system, and in the small part you can influence. You have a choice. You can let the void exist, or you can fill it with awareness, with attention, by stopping and asking questions. And that is where the entire story comes back to you. Not as a final answer, but as a new way of looking. Reality does not require you to understand all of it, but it reacts to the way you are present within it. If you find that this perspective helps you understand the world better, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. See you in the next video, where we will continue to explore big questions in the simplest way.